Hello, thank you for tuning into this Bible study. We got a lot of ground to cover. We're going to be covering only 11 verses, but we're going to be talking about slavery. Exodus 21, 1 through 11 is all about how the Israelites were supposed to treat their Hebrew slaves. So we're going to talk about what that meant for the context of Moses' day, and then we're going to look at slavery as it relates to how we should look at it today. We're also going to look at Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And in those three passages, we'll see what the Old Testament has to say about slavery. We'll also look at a few passages from the New Testament. So join me in prayer, and then let's talk about this rather heavy subject. Lord, thank you. Thank you for your word. Lord, I pray that you will speak through me. Holy Spirit, use me now as an instrument approved. Let these be your words, not mine. Give me the words to say. Give me the confidence to say what you would have me say. Lord, open up our hearts, our minds, our ears, and let us be receptive to your word. I submit this time to you. Thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'm going to break this up into a few different segments. First thing we're going to talk about is the Book of the Covenant. What is that, and why do I intro with that? Then we're going to take Exodus 21, verses 1 through 11, and break them into two segments. We'll talk about verses 1 through 6, and then we'll talk about verses 7 through 11. Then we're going to look at what the New Testament has to say on slavery. And then in conclusion, we're going to look at what it means to be a bondservant for Christ. Before I begin, I just want to make it perfectly clear. The Bible does not condone or institute slavery. Anybody who says that the Bible is a proponent of slavery or of slave ownership or that it instituted slavery has not read the full text. Whenever we read the Bible, we must always understand it and read it from the context of that day. I'm a huge proponent of what's called the inductive Bible study method, which was the very first thing we must do is observe who, what, where, who is the original author, who were they writing to, when were they writing, what was happening in that day, what is the context of the text in that day. Then we look at, after observation, is interpretation. What was the Holy Spirit saying through that original human author to the original audience in that day? Both these first two steps are all in the context of that day. Then, after we have done that, is application, where we ask this question of how should we respond to that text? Ask the Holy Spirit, what should we do based on that information today? So when you read passages that we're going to read like Exodus 21, it doesn't mean that we ought to have Hebrew slaves today. No, we need to understand it from the perspective of the Israelites in front of Mount Sinai in Moses' day. I just want to make that perfectly clear. And then we need to understand, what else does the Bible have to say on the subject? You can take a single verse and you can tweak the Bible to say all kinds of things if you just take a single verse out of context. So that's my goal here, is to give the big, broad context of what the Bible has to say about slavery. Continuing on, the first thing we're going to talk about, what is the Book of the Covenant? Okay, so the Book of the Covenant, that's from Exodus 24. So open up to Exodus 21. You can leave it there. I'm going to flip to Exodus 24. You don't need to go there unless you want to. Exodus 24, verse 7 says, "Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, 'We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey.'" So who is this? He is Moses, and they are the people of Israel. So the Book of the Covenant is considered by most to be from the very end of Exodus 20, actually picking it up on Exodus 20:22, talking about idols, going all the way through Exodus 24, verse 8. It includes a whole series of laws or ordinance or commands that are all basically case law. If this, then this. If this happens, then you should do this. If this happens, then you should do this. And the first segment is verses 22 through 26 of Exodus 20, which we covered last week, dealing with idols. The next segment is the 11 verses we're going to cover today, dealing with Hebrew servants. And then next week, we're going to cover the rest of Exodus 21, looking at verses 12 through 36 as it relates to property, personal injury, and property. How do things happen? If your bull gores another person, what are you supposed to do? Who gets the bull? How do you pay them back? It might as well be case law as you study. If you ever did pre-law or if you ever did business law, you look at cases of situations. If this situation, this happened, and this was the law that was passed by that. That's how our judicial system works, is based on precedents of past laws. So as we look at it, that is the Book of the Covenant. It's mentioned in the King James Version of the Bible 3 times in the Old Testament. You have here Exodus 24:7. It's also in 2 Kings 23:2 and 2 Chronicles 34:30. In all 3 of those instances, the Book of the Covenant is a text that was read that includes laws. We don't know everything that was written in it. We assume that it is these passages from Exodus 20 through 24. Now, I searched in blueletterbible.org. I searched for, in quotations, Book of the Covenant, and found those 3 passages are the only spot that is mentioned. I then switched it over to the NIV, and one additional in the Old Testament popped up, and that's 2 Kings 23:21. So the NIV, it says, the king gave this order to all the people: celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in this Book of the Covenant. So that's what it says in the NIV. It uses the same phrase, Book of the Covenant. Now, the King James Version says, as it is written in the Book of this Covenant. I think in this situation that the King James translation is a better one, because it's talking about this covenant being the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Old Covenant, which is outlined in the Mosaic Law, which is the Pentateuch. It's the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. So it says, celebrate the Passover of the Lord your God, as it is written in the book of this covenant. It's not saying that the Passover is explained in the Book of the Covenant. It's saying that the Passover is part of this covenant, of the Old Covenant of the Mosaic Law, which it is. The Passover is explained in Exodus, as well as in other places in the Old Testament it's covered. But it's not covered in the 10 Commandments, nor is it covered as we continue on, as in depth as it is in Exodus earlier in the Passover. So I hope that makes sense. For all intents and purposes, when you look at what is the Book of the Covenant, it's from Exodus 20, verse 22, through Exodus 24, verse 8. Some do consider the 10 Commandments as part of the Book of the Covenant, which would mean it would start at Exodus 20, verse 1. And we're going to go into these as we go into the future, as I said. So that's the Book of the Covenant, and that is where we're camped out as we continue on going through Exodus in these series of rules and laws. And again, as I said, for all intents and purposes, it is basically a case law of if this happens, then do this, as given to the Israelites in Moses' day. So now we're going to go into our actual passage that we're studying, which is Exodus 21, the first 11 verses. So join me. Exodus 21, verse 1. These are the laws you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. Verse 5, but if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. Verse 7, if a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as a male servant does. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Now, again, we're going to dig into that, but I want to go and see what Leviticus has to say about this. So flip to the next book in your Bible, Exodus and then Leviticus, and we're going to go to Leviticus 25, picking up on verse 39. Leviticus 25, 39. Leviticus 25, 39. If any of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I bought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. We'll come back and talk about the year of Jubilee and what that is. Now let's flip to the next book, which is Deuteronomy. Actually, we're skipping Numbers, sorry. So Leviticus, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. So you're going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 15, picking it up on verse 12. Deuteronomy 15:12. If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. We'll come back to that word redeemed. Redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. But if your servant says to you, I do not want to leave you, because he loves you and your family and is well off with you, then take an awl and push it through his earlobe into the door, and he will become your servant for life. Do the same for your female servant. Do not consider it a hardship to set your servant free, because their service to you these 6 years has been worth twice as much as that of a hired hand, and the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. So as we look at this, we must look at the context of the day. Slavery was common practice in the ancient Near East. Looking at the book of Exodus, we see slavery played out for us and how the Egyptians treated the Israelites. Exodus 1:14. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and all kinds of work in the fields. And all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So they are the Egyptians, and the ones working are the Israelites. They had no rights. They were property. And as we look at the New Testament, Rome, I read one commentary that said that the Roman Empire, a third of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire were slaves. It was common practice of both the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. Slavery was part of society. And as we look at it, there are different ways that a person became a slave. It wasn't simply some element of one race being superior and being enslaved. No, as the passages spoke about, there's an element of economics that could have played into a person becoming a slave. If you had a debt that you could not pay, you then became a servant, an indentured slave until you could pay off that debt. Now, another element or reason why you might become a slave is if your tribe was taken over in a time of war. Tribes warring, cities warring, nations warring, people groups warring. So if your village went and attacked another village, you could choose to kill all the people, or you could take, as the victors, you could take slaves of the people that you had conquered. Looking at the Assyrians as well as the Babylonians as an example. So slavery in the context of that day was common practice. The words here in Exodus 21, as well as Leviticus and Deuteronomy, would have been crazy to the nations surrounding Israel. They would have seen this as insane, to give to your slaves of such wealth, to treat them as not lower life, but to treat them as equals. And as we look at it, the first verse, as we go into this, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. This gets into what is called the year of Jubilee, which you can go to Leviticus. Let me just find my place here again. Leviticus 25 outlines all the elements of what the year of Jubilee was. We read from some elements of Leviticus 25 as it related to how slaves were to be treated in the year of Jubilee. So there's two different years of Jubilee. You have every 7 years, all slaves, Hebrew slaves, were to be set free. Then you have every 7 periods of 7, so that's 49 years, is the great year of Jubilee. At this period, all debts were erased and all land went back to the original title owner. So this played a huge role, both the first 7-year time frame as it related to having slaves, but then also for the 49 years. Your negotiations for contract, if you wanted to buy a piece of land, the year of Jubilee came on a calendar year. So if you're 30 years into it, you would know the cost of the land is going to be less than if you're 45 years into it, because you know you're going to have to give that land back over a period of time once the year of Jubilee hit. Same thing with a loan. If you were going to loan somebody something and next year was the year of Jubilee, well, you would have to forgive that debt in a year's time. So the cost of that debt would be much, much higher than if they had 49 years to pay it back. In the same way, imagine if you take on a slave because they owe you money, but you know that they're going to go free after 6 years. And let's add to this, verse 5, but if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. So there's this element where the slave has a choice if they want to stay or not and be a member of the household. How would this change how the owner of the slave would treat the person that's in service? You treat them as a member of your household. You take care of them. You pay them a wage. You treat them very, very well so that when they are done, they want to stay because they like it so much. It would have been revolutionary. The Egyptians would have thought it was insane, as well as the people groups surrounding them. So that's the important thing to look at when we look at this, is this idea of the slave by choice. We do see this in the New Testament. Paul, Timothy, James, Peter, and Jude, in the intros to their letters, not all of them, because Paul writes quite a few of them, but they intro and title themselves as servants by choice, bondservants for Christ. They take on that title of bondservant. Romans 1:1, Paul says that he's a servant for Christ. Philippians 1:1 mentions both Paul and Timothy as servants for Christ. James 1:1, he refers to himself as a servant for Christ. And 2 Peter 1:1 and Jude 1:1, both Peter and Jude refer to themselves as servants for Christ. Application for today. We are to be servants by choice. But there's also this element of being redeemed that we'll talk about in a second. Jesus, in Matthew 16:24 through 27, then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. As a Christ follower, as a Christian, we are to put ourselves last. Jesus modeled this at the Last Supper when he took off his outer garment and put on an apron and dropped down to a knee and washed the feet of the disciples. He did the lowest of low of positions. God took on the lowest form possible. And then he told the disciples, as I have done, do unto others. Repeat this. The first will be last and the last will be first. We as Christians are to be slaves, to put ourselves last and put everybody else first. We are to be slaves to Christ by choice, bondservants to Christ. So how would these ordinances change how a Hebrew would treat a slave? I already talked about that. This idea that they would be released after 6 years is going to change how you treat them because they're going to go free, but they also have a choice to be able to stay with you. So you're going to treat them as a family member. But now I want to continue on. Dig deeper. Here's a homework assignment if you want to dig a little deeper. Read Jeremiah 34, 8 through 22. This is the story of King Zedekiah and what happened to him when he told God that he would honor the year of Jubilee of setting all slaves free after 6 years, and then he reneged on that, and they took all their slaves back. They didn't free them. Watch what God has to say to him and what the repercussions are of that. So now let's continue on and read verses 7 through 11. Exodus 21, verse 7 through 11. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these 3 things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Now again, we must read this in the context of the day. This is not saying that polygamy is a good thing, and it's also not saying that women are to be treated as property. We live in a different day in the Western world, in the United States, in the UK, etc. We live in a different world than this. There are still places in the world where women are treated as property and are treated as servants. But wherever the Bible is preached, you have people who are boldly proclaiming women's rights and the freedom that women have. And when you look at the New Testament, as it's called the role for men and women, yes, you do see women are called to be submissive to their husbands. But the following passages talk about how men are to be as Christ was to the church. What did Christ do for the church? He died. He was tortured and died. We are to submit to each other, is the idea. And so when you look at the Old Testament, as you look some of these, especially Leviticus, some of these laws, it doesn't mean that we're supposed to implement them in our lives today. We need to understand them in the context of that day and understand what was the principle, why were they in place, and from that understand the application. But then to understand women's rights and the way God wants women to be treated, you need to understand and read the entire text. It's the same thing with slavery. Don't just take a few passages. You need to understand slavery in the context of the entire passage and what Jesus has to say on the subject and what a Christ follower would do in putting others first and being last and being a servant. What would that call us to do? So as we dig into this, verses 7 through 11, the Expositor's Bible Commentary, Barker has this to say. This pericope is just a fancy way of saying passage, this small passage. This passage pertains to a girl who was sold by her father, not for slavery, but for marriage. Nonetheless, she is designated a servant. If the purchaser, the husband or his father, is not satisfied, she is allowed to be redeemed. We'll come back to that in a second. She cannot be sold again, Always she must be treated as a daughter or a freeborn woman, or the forfeit clause will be invoked. If a girl is purchased as a bride, this is what it's saying is that she needs to be treated fairly as a daughter. At this time, it was a common practice to have multiple wives. In this day, we need to keep in mind that women were not independent. They couldn't just go out and get a job. Your livelihood, your life, your protection, your sustenance was all based on your family. So as a woman, if you got married, you were then part of that family. And then if your husband died, there was what was called the kinsman redeemer. You were to be married to a brother within that family. The brother of the husband who died was supposed to marry you to protect you, to make sure that you had everything that you needed and were taken care of. Women who did not have families that took care of them often became prostitutes or ended up dying because they couldn't take care of themselves and no one would feed them. So as we look at this is where we start talking about redemption and an amazing story of redemption and what it means for the kinsman redeemer is looking at the book of Ruth. Ruth's husband dies and she is without and she is in dire straits. And Boaz takes on the role of the kinsman redeemer. Reading the book of Ruth is seeing a picture of God in his redemption of Israel and God redeeming his church, his believers through the blood of Christ. Exodus 6:6. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. That's Exodus 6:6. God is saying to the people of Israel, I'm going to purchase you with a price. I'm going to rescue you. You are mine. I own you. And as we looked at these different passages between Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, in all three, we heard verses that specifically said that Israel had been redeemed or purchased with a price. And that plays into the servitude and this idea of servanthood is that Israel, the people, were not to be servants because they were bought at a price. In the New Testament, Jesus is our Redeemer. He bought our freedom with a price. Luke 1:68, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. 1 Peter 1:18-19, for you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. And that's a reference to the Passover lamb, the sacrifice that was made to buy our freedom. Jesus was that perfect, spotless Passover lamb, the atonement, the redemption price necessary to redeem us. So as we look at this passage as it relates to women, you see here that there's ordinances that are put in place to protect the woman, to keep her safe, to have her be as a daughter to the father, or to have her be freed without paying a price, to have her be redeemed for that opportunity. So when you read this out of context, it sounds totally harsh. But then when you look at it in context, it's actually regulations and ordinances to protect the woman. So here's a question. What does the New Testament teach us about slavery? We're going to go to two passages. The first one is 1 Corinthians 7. So flip with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we're going to pick it up on verse 17. 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned them to, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Verse 21, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Verses 17 through 20 is talking about circumcision, and I included that for context of understanding. Circumcision was a huge contested issue in this day in the early church, and the reason being is because all of the initial believers in Christ were Jewish. So they had been living under the Jewish law, and one of the ordinances was circumcision. The Abrahamic covenant, the sign of the Abrahamic covenant was circumcisions. The Jews were to be circumcised. But Jesus died as one sacrifice for all, paying that one penalty once for all, and freed us from following the law. We are now free under grace. So we no longer have to follow the law. So there was this huge question about, well, does a person have to follow the Jewish law before they can be saved as a Christian, even if they're a Gentile? And circumcision was one of those. That's the context behind this. So he's saying if you were circumcised when you were called as a believer, then you're circumcised. It's fine. If you were not circumcised when you're called as a believer, you don't have to be circumcised. It's a picture that goes on and talks about the fact that if you are a slave when you are called, remain in your role and do the work, but do it as unto Christ. Now it does say, if you're able to gain your freedom, do so. But if you're a slave, be a slave to Christ. It doesn't condone slavery, but what it does is says, be such a good slave as being a slave, a servant to Christ. That's way more important than your position as being a slave or a master, freed or not. In the same way as it doesn't matter whether you are circumcised or uncircumcised, it doesn't matter whether you're a slave or a free person. You're a slave for Christ because of what he did for you on the cross, the redemption that was paid. Continuing on to Ephesians 6. Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 9. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you for whatever good they do, whether you are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Both masters as well as slaves are called to put Christ first. And whatever your role is, if you're a slave or free, you are to live for Christ. This is amazing. He's calling the slave, the person who is owned as property to somebody else, to submit to them with respect and fear and sincerity of heart, and to obey them as if obeying Christ. Why? In doing that, you're going to reflect God's love on that individual, even your master. That is the servitude that Christ calls us to, that God calls us to. Whatever your situation is, live to Christ. It's crazy stuff. It's revolutionary stuff. And for all the people around in this day, if a Roman were to read this, they'd be like, this is insane. This is crazy. It's crazy talk. But that's what the Bible does. It's not being a proponent of slavery or saying that slavery is good. It's saying that God redeemed you for a price. It doesn't matter whether you're a slave or you're free. You're free from the law of sin and death. You're redeemed and have the hope of heaven to wait for. Whether you're owned as property or not, insignificant in comparison to that. So those people who, go out and say that the Bible condones slavery, they haven't read it. They don't understand the context of it. In places where the Bible is read and believed and followed, you have individuals throughout history that stand up for what is right. This is not a political book. Jesus, even in his day, there were Jews that looked to him to be the political leader. Palm Sunday is the celebration of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And there were crowds of people that were cheering, Hosanna in the highest. What they're saying is that Jesus is the Messiah, the promised Messiah, the King of the Jews. Long live the King of the Jews. Save us, Messiah. They were greeting him and treating him with that title of Messiah. But then fast forward to Good Friday, and it's the same crowd that's chanting, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Why? So many of the Jews were expecting Jesus to be a political figure, the Messiah. They were expecting the Messiah, as you look at the Old Testament and the prophecies, they were expecting the Lion of the tribe of Judah to come and right all wrongs. They didn't expect him to be the Lamb. And we who have the full revelation of the Bible know that Jesus has a second coming. When he came for the first time, he came as a lowly lamb and died for the sins of the world. And then when they saw him being tortured and captured by the Romans and realized this guy isn't going to overthrow Rome, he's not going to give us our political freedom, he can't be the Messiah. It's one of the reasons why they were chanting, crucify him. But when Jesus comes back, he comes as a Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he brings down judgment on the whole world. And that will fulfill the rest of the prophecies of the Messiah and his character in bringing both salvation, but also bringing judgment. So when Jesus came, they looked to him to be a king, a political figure. People look at the Bible to put politics on it. Jesus isn't a Republican or a Democrat. I am not a Republican or a Democrat. I am a Christ follower, and it informs everything that I do. And in the same way, when we live that way, things will change. Society changes. Countries change if you live based on these words. Two people that I want to just mention really quick that are examples of people who lived on this book and lived it out in their lives are Harriet Tubman is the first one. And she was a slave in the 1800s who got her freedom, but then rather than just enjoying her freedom, she went back into the South, into the slave territory, and she freed through the Underground Railroad more than 70 slaves. The movie Harriet that came out in 2019 is inspired based off of her story. She was a Christian. She was a Christ follower that lived out her faith in freeing those and being courageous enough to put others first. I'm no Harriet Tubman expert, but I'm impressed by her and what she did and the biographies that I read of her story of living out her faith in action. The other one that I'm actually reading right now is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I didn't know his story, but I picked up The Cost of Discipleship is a text that is listed as an essential read for Christians, The Cost of Discipleship. And the beginning of it has the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's a German that was born and became a Lutheran priest, pastor. And he noticed in Germany a political party called the National Socialist Party, National Socialism. And it was growing in popularity. And he saw that it wasn't following the Bible. And Germany was getting behind the National Socialist Party and its key figurehead, Adolf Hitler. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer chose to stand based on what the Bible said, as opposed to what people wanted. He had the opportunity before World War II broke out to leave Germany. He spent time both in New York in school as well as teaching in London, and he chose to go back to Germany intentionally because his goal was to support the Christ follower and the evangelical church in Germany to the extent that he believed that Adolf Hitler would lose, that the world would see what he truly was, and he would be defeated, and then Germany and the church, the evangelical church in Germany, would need to rise again, and he wanted to support that church. And he looked at the situation and said, how can I come back and support them if I don't go through it with them? So he chose to go to Germany in the midst of World War II and to stand against Hitler. When Germany was supporting him as the way for their societies to succeed, he stood based on what the Bible said and went against the political dogma of the day. And in 1943, April of 1943, he was arrested by the Gestapo, was in concentration camps for 2 years. On April 9th of 1945, he was martyred because he would not submit to the Third Reich. He would not submit to the National Socialist Party in Nazi Germany. He refused, and he stood on the principles of the Bible, and he was killed for that. Those are examples of two individuals who stand, and there's so many. Fox's Book of Martyrs, phenomenal read that goes through and just tells the story of martyr after martyr after martyr after martyr, of people who lived out their faith, who put others first to the extent that they were willing to die for their faith. Does the Bible talk about slavery? Yeah, it does. Does it outright say all slavery should be abolished? No, it doesn't. But as you live out and walk out the words of this, slavery is abolished. As it is mentioned in the text, it regulates it. It brings it into the context of the text. So that's it for today. Next week, we're going to continue on as we look at rules and ordinances. And we have several chapters going through these if this, then that situation. I don't know how long. I wanted to camp out on these 11 verses because there's a lot to talk about when we talk about slavery. So I don't know how long I'll camp out on those ordinances and laws as we go through them. Lord, thank you. Thank you that you paid the price to redeem us. And based on that, we ought to live our lives as slaves by choice for you. Putting others first, putting you first, living our lives redeemed in servitude to you. Lord, I pray that would permeate through us, that we would live that out in our lives. Thank you, Lord, for your word. Thank you for this time. Pray that also in Jesus' name. Amen. Awesome, guys. Thanks. I'll see you next week as we dig into the rest of Exodus 21.